Good morning, PTNI's Daily Show. Happy Friday morning. Hope your Friday is off to a great start. I will be your host, Alan, today, COO Vice, faculty member and a fitness athlete in modern management of the older adult divisions. Today, on the best day of the week, it's Fitness Athlete Friday. Before we get started, remember we have our Quarantine Con Ed package available on ptnis.com. Click the Resources tab. It's on the bottom. Get signed up for 5 free lectures to keep you busy while you're stuck at home. If you're like us here in Michigan, we just got the quarantine order extended a little bit longer, so we'll be at home at least 3 more weeks. That's hard to imagine that we've been doing this for 3 weeks already and we have to do it for 3 more weeks, but that's what we've got going on in Michigan. We also had Justin drop some persistent pain management video lectures. Grab those at bit.ly/pain series. Get hooked up with 3 video lectures. Justin taking you through some key concepts for goal setting and education with patients with persistent pain. And then we have exercise physiology redux dropping on Monday morning. Our first mini course series of 4 lectures worth 6 CUs. That'll be dropping on Monday, so keep your eyes peeled for that one. On the fitness athlete side of things, we have both essential foundations and advanced concepts starting April 26th and 27th. So very rarely do those sync up together, but they'll be starting the last week of April. And then the vast majority of our online courses restart somewhere around the second week of May. So make sure you check out the website for the next start dates. So what are we talking about today? We're talking about acute to chronic workload ratio, ACWR. We've talked about this on the podcast before in the past. We talk about it a lot in depth in our fitness athlete courses and kind of in general in the fitness athlete division. So what is it? We'll talk about it very briefly, a little reminder in case you forgot or in case you've never heard of it. What is it? It's a comparison of 7 days of acute training, so within the past week, to chronic training. A couple different models use different timetables here. The past 21 days, so the past 3 weeks, the past 28 days or 4 weeks, or the past month of exercise volume. And volume is calculated by multiplying session RPE for the entire training session multiplied by time. So you get kind of this unitless measure of RPE times time. If you exercise for 50 minutes and you say that it was an RPE of 5 for the whole time, it would be 250 unitless units. You do a whole bunch of math, and with the acute to chronic workload ratio model, you divide acute by chronic and you get a ratio. Some good research by Gavin and colleagues, a little bit older now, maybe the past 10 years, built upon some research way back from the 70s from a person named Bannister that thought there was some sort of relationship between that 7-day training to the past month of training, and then it could somehow be correlated to injury. And so Gavin and colleagues used that ratio and determined that if you are between 0.8 to 1.3 acute to chronic, you are in this mathematical sweet spot where you're at the lowest injury risk. If you're below that ratio, which means you probably don't have enough training, you're not getting enough training, you're under training, you're at a higher risk for injury. And if you're above that, you're receiving very large spikes in your training volume relative to a low chronic baseline, you're at risk for overtraining. And so some criticisms of this research, not of the Bannister concept, that model is pretty solid, but of the math and the model of the acute to chronic workload ratio have started to come out in the past couple years. First and foremost is looking at this research, this line of research, and trying to generalize it to most folks, the general population, folks who are just exercising maybe a couple hours a week, and looking at this research and this math from Gavin and colleagues and saying, well, this was done on professional sports players, specifically rugby players. So they have very high chronic baselines of fitness, right? They've been exercising, they've been doing strength and conditioning, of course, for years, but they've also been playing sports for many years. So they have a very high chronic baseline of training. And they also have these very high acute spikes, right? Every weekend almost they play some games that are a couple hours long that are a giant spike in their acute workload as well. And so if we take that and try to apply that to the regular person, that almost never checks out, right? The average person that's running a couple days a week, going to CrossFit, or just going to the Global Gym a couple days a week, has a relatively low but stable chronic baseline, and doesn't really encounter any acute spikes, right? You're not usually working with somebody who's running 3 to 5 hours a day, and then running an ultra marathon on the weekend as well. Those people are very, very, very rare. And so the math, the kind of the whole model was done on these very high level sports players, people who are paid to exercise all day long, basically, to be doing strength and conditioning a couple times a day, to be doing practice, and then not really having anything else going on in their life. So they're able to tolerate having a very high chronic baseline, and also large acute spikes, especially with their weekend games. Another criticism of this model is that the math is out of control. We try to pare it down as much as we can when we teach it in the fitness athlete division, but it's very hard. It's very math involved. Some folks try and take the paper and calculate their own acute to chronic workload ratio, and it usually never works. And that kind of goes back to the first point, is that the math will never really check out. It never can be really generalized to the general public, because the math involved in the research papers to get that ratio were so out of whack, because the volume was so high in these professional players. So we have to ask ourselves, can this really be generalized to most people? That person who is running a few days a week, cycling a few days a week, going to CrossFit a few days a week, does that ratio still make sense? And we'll see that a regular person, if we go through the math, will never achieve that high level of chronic baseline, and they'll never actually hit those acute spikes either. And so a newer line of research, not really new so much as a fact check, evidence check on Gabbett and colleagues' work, is a guy named Franco Impellizzeri. Sorry, Franco, I tried my best. So the past couple years, Franco and his colleagues have been going through the ACWR research and just trying to replicate it. And what they're finding is that again and again, they're unable to do so. And they recently released a paper, and I'll drop that in the comments here after the podcast, that at the end of March, that it should kind of be dismissed as overall as a concept, that we shouldn't really look at acute to chronic workload ratio overall as a concept, and even going so far as trying to have all of Gabbett's papers retracted from all the journals that he has published research in. So kind of a heated back and forth between those two research groups, but that research group by Franco, looking at ACWR and saying that the math never checks out no matter how many times we run it. We don't really think we can use this ratio appropriately, especially if we want to continue to replicate this line of research down the road with different populations. It's not going to check out. And so, avoiding kind of the Twitter drama of those research groups going at it and trying to have papers retracted, what are the practical implications for acute to chronic workload ratio? I think overall the theory is sound. We know, even without this line of research, without seeing the mathematical numbers, that we know kind of inherently that there is a sweet spot, whatever the math might end up being, where exercise, especially strength training, does have a protective effect. Some good research by Claudino and colleagues showing 3 to 6 days a week of CrossFit training. Those CrossFit members going 3 to 6 days are the least likely to be injured. What does that tell us? That tells us there is a sweet spot there, right? If you are going 0, 1, or 2 days a week, you are at more risk for injury. Why? You have a very low chronic training load, and when you do show up to CrossFit, that's a huge surge and acute spike, right? So it makes sense that you'd be at a higher injury risk. On the other end of that spectrum, folks going more than 6 days a week, so I'll do the math for you, that's folks going every single day without a rest day, are on the other end of the spectrum at a higher risk for injury in this research. And those are folks who are overtraining, right? Those are folks who are not taking a break, training 7 days a week, training not 24/7, but probably training multiple sessions a day, 7 days a week, just not taking a break. We know as well as PTs that those folks are at a higher injury risk. Those folks are at an injury risk for overtraining. And so we know that not enough or too much exercise is a risk factor for injury. We also know undertraining, besides from a musculoskeletal standpoint, is a risk factor for cardiometabolic things as well. Heart disease, diabetes, high blood pressure, developing those comorbidities that we see. So too much of an acute spike, especially of the same motions, can exceed what the body is prepared for. We see this clinically this time of the year, right? It's springtime in Michigan. It's warm. It's 40s, 50s, and sunny. Those of you from the south are laughing that we think that's warm. But what we see this time of year, there's a ton of people starting to come into the clinic. I've had a couple people text me this week already, hey, I've got shin splints. Hey, I have calf pain. Why? Because they haven't ran for 6 months because it's been cold, and now that it's a little bit warm, they went out there and they hit a 2-mile run, a 3-mile run, a 5-mile run. And so they've encountered that massive acute spike against a very low chronic baseline of running. And so we need to be aware of that. We need to educate patients and athletes on that you need to kind of work back up to it, even if you were running 5 miles a couple times a day before winter, because you haven't run all winter. We need to kind of work back up to that. It will come back quicker than you think, but we still need to work back up to it. And so what else do we need to be mindful of? Those sudden increases in workload, but also specific workload. We can see this even in folks who do have a chronic training baseline. So that person that maybe is in the gym every day, are they starting to do the same repetitive movements? That can also be a risk factor for injury. So that same focused acute spike in workload is an issue, right? Having an athlete who trains CrossFit every day, maybe high volume sessions, is used to a lot of volume, suddenly says, I'm going to practice handstand walking every day for 30 minutes after I'm done training. Or I'm going to practice pull-ups every single day for 30 minutes after I'm done training. Yes, that person is conditioned to a high amount of volume, but that's a very specific spike in workload that we also need to educate them on. You can't practice the same movement every single day. That's going to give you issues no matter how much volume you're used to, no matter how strong you are. We need to space that out. We need to maybe only practice pull-ups after class 1 or 2 extra days a week. We can't do it every day. It's going to develop problems no matter how strong you are, who you are. And then we know that over time, chronic workload without a break. So that person who is training 6 or 7 days a week, that person who is continually trying to increase reps and sets and load, that person needs a deload or taper phase, right? That's periodization. We need to build to a peak and test a new 1 rep, or maybe we have a powerlifting competition, whatever we're building towards. But then after that, we do need to deload or taper and give our nervous system a break. Otherwise, if we just keep going full steam ahead with that chronic baseload, we know that's also a risk factor for injury. And this is where in PT we can have a really big impact. We get folks in the clinic who are really deconditioned, who have maybe not exercised in a very long time or ever. We can use PT to start to slowly build up that chronic workload, right? We can have them do things like remoms and little short workouts. I love to give people finishers after a PT session. So they've had an hour of PT with me. I like to give them something that's maybe 5 to 10 minutes, something that's mechanically simple, something that they can usually go do on their own, and move through a couple rounds for time, move through a little remom, get a little bit of intensity, but also develop a little bit more of that chronic workload and build kind of that robust baseline that we know people need to have, especially if we're wanting them to transition to a more regular exercise program after PT. So use your PT sessions, start to integrate things like finishers, especially with my CrossFit athletes when they're injured and they're used to a higher amount of volume and they're just not getting it because of their injury. I love to give them stuff that I know is going to be pain-free and mechanically simple, that's still going to get their heart rate up, still going to give them the volume that they're used to. Have them do some intervals on the stationary bike or the assault bike or the rower, whatever they can handle. Get in an extra 10 to 20 minutes after PT and start to slowly integrate that volume back in to develop that chronic baseline of workload that we know we want folks to have, because that will better let them tolerate acute spikes, whatever that may check out to be in the math. So Those are some practical implications. That's how I view acute to chronic workload ratio from a practical standpoint, from the clinical standpoint. I think the biggest problem with all of this research is that it is so math heavy. It is very hard to even comprehend. It's kind of striking how some of these papers are written, and the intended audience is maybe a personal trainer or a strength coach. So it's hard to conceptualize and understand in general, even harder to implement. And it turns out some of the research may be faulty to begin with. But those are some practical implications, how to take this and use it in the clinic with your patients and athletes. Know that we need to look out for sudden increases in workload, especially after a long period of time of non-exercising. Big spikes in specific workload, even in folks who are conditioned to a high volume, and then not taking a break, not deloading or tapering, not taking rest days throughout the week, that kind of chronic workload that never gets a break. And then use your PT sessions to slowly inject some chronic workload into your patients. Training volume, try to add in little 5, 10, 15-minute finishers after PT, rounds on the bike, maybe step-ups and calories on the rower. Keep it really simple. Keep it something that they can maybe even do on their own while they're off in the corner, and just get that extra workload in, knowing that's going to make them stronger and more resilient against injury in the future. So I hope that helps. We get this question often. Every time Franco publishes a new paper or has a fiery YouTube video where he rants on acute to chronic workload ratio, we always get a couple emails and messages in the fitness athlete division about what we think now based on the newest paper or YouTube video, and kind of our thought process throughout this has been the same. It doesn't really matter what the math is. The theory is what matters the most, because for most of our patients and clients, the math will never check out, but the concepts remain sound. So I hope that helps. If you have any questions or you'd like to discuss this some more, we're happy to do so. But saw some questions come up with this through the past week in the ICE Students page, so thought I would jump on here and address it. Hope you all have a great weekend. I would say it's going to be a great sunny weekend in Michigan here, but it snowed, rained, sleeted, and hailed yesterday in addition to being sunny. So I have no idea which way is up anymore. It doesn't matter because I'll be stuck in the house anyways. So have a great weekend. Have a great Friday. We'll see you all next week. Don't forget to check out Quarantine Con Ed, the Persistent Pain Management lecture series, and then keep your eyes peeled Monday for the new exercise physiology course. Have a great weekend, everybody. Bye.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.